A new Idaho bill is trying to police whether or not children adhere to gender stereotypes, including their appearance, how they dress, or even what their nickname is. The new Republican bill would require teachers, mental health counselors, even doctors to tell parents quickly whether it appears that their child is trying to socially transition to a different sex. It would essentially enshrine in state policy what dressing and looking like a certain gender was. These adults could be fined up to $100,000 and even lose their license if they don't notify parents about a child's intent to transition. This is another state bill trying to eliminate trans kids from public life. It's not just targeting this vulnerable minority, it's also making it harder for everyone to live freely in whatever way they choose. Recently, we've seen a number of state and federal policies aimed at cracking down on the very existence of both trans kids and adults. Recently, in Iowa, the state seized trans people's driver's licenses overnight, forcing them to change their gender marker back to their sex assigned at birth or face going to jail. This new law in Idaho is taking aim directly at kids and trusted adults around them, placing a penalty on being an adult that a child can confide in about wanting to change their gender, regardless of what their parents say at home. The ACLU of Idaho has already come out swinging against what they're referring to as a social transitioning ban. They opposed this legislation and they called it a dangerous bill that would require trusted adults, such as teachers and counselors, to monitor children for signs that they are not conforming to gender stereotypes. If they fail to do so or fail to report such information, they could face steep legal penalties for withholding information or aiding or abetting a social transition, including up to $100,000 in civil fines. The bill's excessively broad definition of social transition applies to changes in a student's name, pronouns, and even their appearance and how they dress. Forcing school employees and medical professionals, including counselors, to monitor and out students who have questions about their gender identity is dangerous for trans kids and a serious violation of privacy for all students. Moreover, this bill threatens to undermine bedrock free speech protections for students, teachers, and healthcare professionals. Politicians who stand for small government and personal liberties should not regulate how people dress or express themselves. It's ironic that Republicans constantly say they want big government out of our lives, that they abhor government regulations and don't want other people reaching into their homes and dictating how they and their children behave. But this bill would do the exact opposite of that. It would give government unmitigated power to police how students dress, appear, and even what they want to be called, their nicknames, their hairstyles, even their choice of clothing. It's also predicated on the idea that parents should have the ultimate authority over their children. But in other cases, when parents support their trans children and consent to things like gender affirming medical care, well, Republicans oppose that too. The reality is, the only consistent viewpoint they have around trans kids is that they don't think trans kids should exist. And these types of bills and laws are a blatant way to erode the rights of trans people everywhere. They also happen to erode everyone's rights at the exact same time. But Republicans don't care about that as long as they can make trans people go away. Despite being such a tiny minority of people, this is a proven way to excite their base and make an enemy out of someone who poses no threat to them whatsoever. Republicans are distracting their base from who's really ruining society, people like billionaires and things like environmental pollution. Instead of focusing on real issues, they want their base to demonize and focus on trans kids and adults. We can see that so clearly in this bill, the text of which is just 3 pages long. And the proposed name of this law is the Pediatric Secretive Transitions Parental Rights Act. A real mouthful that basically implies that doctors are secretly trying to trans kids without their parents' knowledge. The reality is, Republicans won't even let parents dictate their children's medical preferences when they want to because they hate trans people and trans kids so much. Reading on, the bill states that parents have a fundamental right to raise their children and make medical and educational decisions on their behalf, which is already a right that parents have. And again, one that Republicans contest when those parents make choices that Republicans don't like. It also says that medical and social sex transitions can inflict severe and irreversible harm to a child's well being. The reality is, not being allowed to transition and facing things like transphobia from a young age can also create serious, lifelong, and irreversible damages. But Republicans aren't concerned about this. This isn't actually about the well being of these kids. This is about control. It's about authoritarianism, and it's about dictating the way you're allowed to be dependent on the sex you were assigned at birth. This is terrible for women in particular, who Republicans at large view as second class citizens, subservient and subordinate to men always. It's deeply ironic that these types of legislation are supposed to protect women and girls when the reality is that they would erode and roll back their rights and make them more vulnerable and unsafe than ever. This bill even refers to parents of potentially trans kids as aggrieved parties, implying that just having a kid who is trans or thinks they may be is some sort of slight against the parent. But this perfectly reflects Republicans' worldview around trans kids, which is that they don't believe in trans kids. They don't think that there's ever a case of a kid actually being trans. They instead believe in a conspiracy theory that teachers and doctors and other institutional sources who they inherently distrust are trying to take kids away and turn them trans without parents' knowledge or oversight. It's not a reality. It's just not happening. But this type of bill is predicated on the notion of a fake conspiracy theory. Idaho already bars trans kids from being able to receive many types of gender affirming care, including transition surgeries. So instead, they're now going after something that they are referring to as a social transition, which they say means the process by which an individual goes from identifying with and living as a gender that corresponds to the individual's sex to identifying with and living as a gender different from the individual's sex, and may involve social, legal, or physical changes, including adopting a name, pronouns, appearance, or dress that does not correspond to the individual's sex. So basically, let's look at a real world example. As a child, when I was in high school, I cut my hair really, really short, and sometimes I wore boy clothes. This wasn't because I was trans or because I wanted to transition or even because I identified as a boy or wanted to change my gender at all. This is just because I was experimenting with different fashion styles at a young age. And of course, I am a queer woman, so that's not surprising. Lots of kids do this, especially teenagers. It's a time for self experimentation and figuring out what you're interested in, the way that you want to live your life as an adult in the future. This bill wants to police that. This type of law would force my teachers and counselors to tell my parents that I was socially transitioning based on the way I cut my hair and the clothes I chose to wear, even though I wasn't even trans. But this is exactly the type of privacy violation and the type of very disturbing and dangerous policing of gender stereotypes that this law would require, or else face these teachers and counselors being fined to the tune of thousands of dollars or even lose their license. Because if we read on, we see that the specific policy here is that these covered entities would have 72 hours to notify parents of things like their child being asked to be referred to with different pronouns or titles that don't correspond to their biological sex, even nicknames or derivatives of nicknames in school records or otherwise. The use of locker rooms, restrooms, changing rooms, or overnight lodging designated for the opposite biological sex, participating on athletic team or other sex separated school activities designated for the opposite sex. Basically, if any of these things happen, these covered entities have to tell parents right away, or otherwise, those parents could sue them. The Attorney General of Idaho could investigate them and face a penalty of up to $100,000, as well as potentially losing their license. There are so many obvious flaws with a bill like this that I don't even know where to start. For example, there was another girl at my high school who played on the boys' football team as a kicker. That didn't mean she was socially transitioning. It's just that segregating students based on sex doesn't always work. That's part of a free and fair society where girls have the same opportunities as boys. That's really at the heart of what these Idaho Republicans are trying to do. They're trying to clamp down on opportunities for young girls, which are the main population that would be affected by this, since there are already so few trans students to begin with. Over on Blue Sky, journalist Chad Loader made a great point, which is that if gender were the immutable biological reality they claim to believe it is, they wouldn't need to spend so much energy policing it like this. And that's 100% true. The reality is that people don't always adhere to gender stereotypes, and that's perfectly okay because all of those stereotypes were just made up in the first place. There's no biological reality that says women have to wear dresses and men have to wear trousers. But for hundreds of years, that was the social norm that was required and policed and enforced. Over the past several decades, we've seen so much progress related to issues like feminism and LGBTQ equality, things that allow anyone to dress however they like, pursue whatever occupation they please, take part in activities, choose what name and pronouns and nicknames they prefer. We have those freedoms because people fought for them. Now, Republicans are trying to undo them, roll them back, and force us into the past. At the same time, it's so ironic that this is happening in a place like Idaho, where these types of legislative efforts should be focused elsewhere. According to iowaeducationnews.org, Idaho ranks really low in the nation on education. For example, 20% of Idaho high school students do not graduate on time, and 68% of Idaho fourth graders are not proficient in reading. In 2023, ProPublica ran this piece called Collapsing Roofs, Broken Toilets, Flooded Classrooms inside the worst funded schools in the nation. This piece focuses on Idaho, which spends less on schools per student than any other state. It says kids are sweating, freezing, and struggling to learn. Scrolling down a little bit, and ProPublica reports no other state spends less on education per student than Idaho, according to a recent report from the US Census Bureau, which surveys and ranks school finance systems. It also ranks last in the nation in terms of school infrastructure spending per pupil. So, over the past several decades, rural districts across the state have faced these challenges. To improve or replace aging and sometimes dangerous facilities, they must appeal to local taxpayers and clear some of the nation's most restrictive thresholds for school funding. Despite urgent needs, most of these efforts fail, an investigation by the Idaho Statesman and ProPublica has found. As a result, students across the state must learn amid dire conditions. This is so much worse than any supposed risk or harm posed by students not adhering to gender stereotypes. But of course, Idaho Republicans want their constituents to focus on trans kids instead of the glaring problems in Idaho that are their responsibility to fix. The government of this state has essentially said students and schools are on their own, no matter how dangerous or unsanitary learning conditions are for vulnerable children. This is why students in Idaho are not learning. They are behind in reading and math and other important curriculum that they need to survive and thrive as adults. These children need help. They do not need state Republicans policing the clothes they wear and the nicknames they have. They need to be able to learn in safe environments. That is the need that the government is supposed to answer to, not whether or not children can have a short haircut or wear a skirt at school. They are inventing a fake crisis to solve, and people around the country have had enough of this. Trans issues activated a lot of the Republican base in previous elections, but enough is enough. It's time for people in Idaho and beyond to pull their head out of the sand. This stuff about trans kids does not matter. What matters is that vulnerable kids everywhere get the support and resources they need. This Idaho bill has yet to pass the House, and it has a strong playing field of opponents already coming out against it. But it reflects a growing patchwork of legislation across states exactly like this. Legislation attacking trans people, especially trans kids, at a time when our attention really needs to be focused elsewhere. There's nothing wrong with kids transitioning, there's nothing wrong with being trans. These Republicans just want you to think that there is so that they can distract you from the corruption in your backyard. Don't listen to them and don't let them steal your focus. There are much bigger, real problems to solve.